Imagine a late-night craving. You open your refrigerator, the cool light illuminating a dozen choices. A slice of pizza, leftover chicken, a cup of yogurt. It is simple, fast, and safe. Now, forget all of that. Let us travel back 700 years into the dark, muddy streets of a medieval city. You are hungry. Your only option for a quick meal is a stall on the street, lit by a smoky lantern. The vendor hands you a hot meat pie, its crust a golden brown. But what meat is it, really? Did the baker use the unsellable scraps from the butcher's block? Or is it something far worse, something gathered from the street? Tonight, we will not be exploring the grand banquets of kings with their roasted swans. We will be diving into the belly of history, into the raw and often disgusting reality of what everyday people truly ate. We will discover the taste of medieval junk food, the overwhelming importance of bread, and how the seasons and religion dictated every single bite. This is the story of the taste of the Middle Ages, a world of flavors both bland and bizarre, where every meal was a small battle for survival. Now, before we take our first bite, and you get comfortable for the night, if you are fascinated by the forgotten details of daily life in the past, please take a moment to leave a like and to subscribe. Only do so if you find real value in what we do here. And as always, I would love to know from what part of the world you are listening tonight, and what time it is where you are. Feel free to leave it in the comments. It is a quiet fascination to see our community of night owls and history lovers spread across the globe. All right, the time has come. Find your most comfortable position. Dim the lights. Let the sounds of your own kitchen fade away. And let us enter the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages. To understand food in the Middle Ages, one must first forget our modern supermarkets, those temples of abundance where every fruit and vegetable is available year-round. The medieval table was ruled by a relentless tyranny, that of the seasons. There were times of plenty and times of scarcity, and the entire life of a peasant revolved around this unchangeable, unforgiving cycle. Summer was a period of relative wealth. The small kitchen gardens behind the wattle and daub cottages were bursting with life. Peas, broad beans, cabbages, onions, and leeks formed the basis of the diet. Fruit trees offered apples, pears, and plums, rare and precious bursts of sugar in a largely savory world. But this abundance was fleeting, a brief window of freshness in a year of preservation. Autumn was the season of back-breaking labor, of the great harvest that would determine a family's survival through the winter. It was the time to bring in the wheat, the barley, and the oats. But the largest portion of this harvest did not belong to the one who had sown it. A significant portion, often a tenth, went to the church, the tithe. Another, even larger portion, went to the lord of the manor. What remained was the family's treasure, to be managed with a constant, gnawing anxiety. Then came winter, a long, dark, and cold tunnel. The earth was frozen, unproductive. Survival depended entirely on what had been stored. Food was a matter of preservation, of salted and smoked meat, of root vegetables like turnips and carrots kept in sand in the cellar, of grains kept safe from the ever-present rats. And finally, the most dreaded period of all, the end of winter, just before the spring. The Anglo-Saxons called it the hunger month. The stores were at their lowest. The stored grain was beginning to sprout or molder. The salted meat was gone. This was a time of real, grinding hunger, a time when people were forced to subsist on thin soups made from wild herbs and tree bark, waiting with a quiet desperation for the first signs of life to return to the natural world. At the heart of this struggle for survival was the most important food of all, the absolute pillar of the medieval diet, bread. But bread was not simply bread. It was a social marker as powerful as a title of nobility. At the top of the pyramid was the Lord's bread, the white bread. Made from the finest, most pure wheat flour, it was light, airy, an unimaginable luxury for 99% of the population. Its whiteness was a symbol of purity and status, a way of saying, I do not eat the same food as the common folk. Below that was the bread of the townsman, the artisan, the merchant, a darker loaf, often made from a mixture of wheat and rye. It was dense, nourishing, the fuel of the urban working class. And at the very bottom was the peasant's bread, the maslin. It was often black, as heavy and dense as a brick, made from a mixture of whatever grains were available, rye, barley, oats, and sometimes even ground peas or beans to increase the volume. It was baked not in a personal oven, an unthinkable luxury, but in the Lord's communal oven, a service for which a tax had to be paid. This bread was often sour, its crust as hard as stone, but it was the heart of every meal. It was the food that made it possible to keep working, to survive. For a peasant to eat white bread would have been an act of social presumption almost as serious as wearing the clothes of a nobleman. Your bread told the world who you were. This hierarchy of bread and this tyranny of the seasons formed the backdrop for every meal, every bite, every day of medieval life. It was a world where food was never taken for granted, where hunger was a constant neighbor, and where taste was often secondary to a single, overriding question: would this keep you alive until tomorrow? If bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, then the house built upon that foundation, the daily reality of sustenance for the vast majority of the population, was a single, humble, and endlessly adaptable dish: pottage. To call it a soup would be to give it a certain elegance it did not possess. To call it a stew would imply a richness it rarely achieved. Pottage was its own entity. It was a thick, slow-cooked gruel of grains, vegetables, and whatever else could be found. A single meal that often served as both breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Its defining characteristic was not its flavor, but its sheer, monotonous, and life-sustaining presence. Let us step into the one-room cottage of a peasant family like Arnaud's, as the evening meal is being prepared. The process begins not with a trip to the market, but with a walk to the small kitchen garden, the hortus, that lies just outside the door. Here, in this small, carefully tended patch of earth, is the family's entire vegetable larder. The main ingredient is whatever is available, whatever the season will allow. In the summer, it might be fresh peas and broad beans. In the autumn, it is the hardier root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and carrots. But the most common, the most reliable, and the most scorned of all the pottage ingredients is the humble cabbage. It is the food of last resort, the vegetable that will grow in almost any soil, in almost any weather. Its smell as it boils for hours over the fire is a constant, defining aroma of peasant life, a smell of poverty and endurance. The preparation is simple and unchanging. Elspeth, Arnaud's wife, takes the vegetables she has gathered and chops them roughly with a small, worn knife. She does not peel the root vegetables. To do so would be to waste a precious layer of sustenance. They are simply washed or wiped clean of the worst of the dirt and thrown into the great black iron cauldron that hangs permanently over the central hearth. To the vegetables she adds the grains, not the fine wheat of the Lord's bread, but a coarse mixture of barley and oats, the hardiest and cheapest of all the cereals. She might add a handful of dried peas or beans which have been soaking in a bowl of water for hours to soften them. Then comes the water, hauled from the village well, and a pinch of precious salt. And then the cooking begins. The cauldron hangs over the fire for hours. its contents slowly simmering, the liquid reducing, the flavors of the different ingredients melting together into a single, uniform taste. There is no complex seasoning. The only flavor comes from the vegetables themselves and from a few common herbs that grow wild at the edge of the fields: parsley, sage, and perhaps a little thyme. Sometimes, for a special occasion, or if the family has been fortunate, a small piece of salted pork or bacon, mostly fat, will be added to the pot. It is not enough to provide a real taste of meat for everyone, but its fat will render down into the pottage, giving it a richness and a flavor that is a rare and celebrated luxury. This is the pottage. It is a simple, nutritious, and incredibly boring meal. But it is hot, it is filling, and it is what stands between a peasant family and starvation. It is eaten not from individual plates, but from a shared, central bowl, with each family member using their own spoon or a piece of hard black bread to scoop up their portion. The taste is always the same: a thick, earthy, and slightly sour flavor. It is the taste of the soil, the taste of the season, the taste of survival. But what of the truly strange and gross recipes that filled the bellies of the common folk? These were born of desperation, of the need to use every single part of an animal, to waste nothing. The abattoirs of the city were not just a source of prime cuts for the wealthy. They were a source of survival for the poor. The organs, the intestines, the head, the feet, the parts of the animal that the rich would not touch, were known as the umbles, and it is from this word that we get the phrase "to eat humble pie," a pie made from the discarded umble parts of the deer. The blood of the pig was a precious commodity. It was mixed with oats and suet and herbs, and then stuffed into a clean section of the animal's own intestine to create black pudding, a rich, iron-heavy sausage that could be smoked and preserved for the lean months of winter. The head of a pig or a sheep would be boiled for hours until the meat fell from the bones, which would then be set in a jelly made from its own boiled-down cartilage to create a dish known as head cheese. It was a wobbly, gelatinous, and surprisingly flavorful source of protein. Even the feet were not wasted. A pig's trotter, boiled for hours, would yield a rich, gelatinous stock that was the foundation of many a peasant pottage. These were not dishes for the faint of heart. They were the food of necessity, the clever and resourceful creations of a people who understood that to survive, nothing could be wasted. They were the true and often forgotten taste of the Middle Ages.
The pottage was the unchanging culinary horizon of peasant life. But this horizon shifted in subtle colors and textures with the turning of the great wheel of the year. It was a mirror of the land, reflecting the fleeting abundance of summer as vividly as the stark, frozen scarcity of winter. The contents of the black iron cauldron hanging over the hearth were a calendar, a story of the family's struggle and survival told one simmering day at a time. In the height of summer, the pottage experienced its brief, luxurious golden age. The base of grains remained the same, that thick, sustaining gruel of barley and oats, but it was enriched by the daily treasures of the kitchen garden. Elspeth would return from the small plot of land behind the cottage with her apron full. She would add freshly picked peas, their sweetness a shocking and delightful contrast to the blandness of the grains. She would add tender broad beans and the first small, delicate green beans of the season. Young onions and leeks, pulled straight from the earth, would be chopped roughly, their sharp, pungent flavor giving the entire dish a liveliness, a taste of the sun and the soil. This was the only time of year when the pottage tasted of freshness, tasted of life. Sometimes, on a particularly fortunate day, a foraging trip into the nearby woods would yield a handful of wild mushrooms, or a cluster of tart wild berries. These were gifts from nature, and their addition to the pot transformed a simple meal into a small, celebratory feast, a taste of a world beyond the confines of their own small field. Then, as the days grew shorter and the air cooler, autumn would arrive. The season of the harvest brought a new, more robust character to the pottage. The delicate vegetables of summer disappeared, replaced by the hardy, reliable root vegetables that would form the bedrock of their winter diet. Great earthy turnips, sweet parsnips, and pale, woody carrots were pulled from the ground. They gave the pottage a thicker, heavier consistency and a sweeter, more profound flavor. This was the food of preparation, the food that was meant to fortify the body, to build up a layer of fat in anticipation of the cold to come. This was also the time when, if the family had been fortunate enough to raise a pig, it would be slaughtered. The slaughter was a crucial event in the peasant calendar, a moment of brutal necessity that promised survival. Every single part of the animal was used. The blood was carefully collected to make black pudding. The best cuts of meat were heavily salted to be preserved for the deepest winter months. And the umbles, the head, the feet, the organs, were the first to be consumed, often finding their way into the cauldron. For a few glorious weeks, the pottage was rich with the flavor of fat and meat, a savory, life-affirming stew that would be a warm, golden memory during the lean, gray months ahead. Winter transformed the pottage into its purest, most depressing, and most essential form. Fresh vegetables were a distant memory, a story told to the children. The base of the dish was now composed of dried peas and beans, hard as stones, which had to be soaked for hours in a bowl of precious water to become even remotely edible. The only vegetables were the cabbages that had been preserved in brine, their taste sharp and sour, and the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, which were often soft and beginning to sprout. The dish became a thick, grayish, almost uniform sludge, its taste monotonous and slightly bitter. The only added flavor came from the rare, carefully rationed piece of salted lard, which was used with extreme parsimony, more to perfume the steam than to be eaten as a piece of meat. To eat in winter was not a pleasure. It was a grim, repetitive act of survival, a daily struggle to ingest enough calories to keep the cold from consuming you. But the most dreaded period, the true test of endurance, was the end of winter, the beginning of spring, the hunger gap. The grain stores were at their lowest. The bottom of the barrel was a visible and terrifying reality. The root vegetables in the cellar had either been eaten or had begun to rot. The salted meat was a memory. It was at this moment that the pottage became a dish of pure improvisation and desperation. Elspeth would turn to the awakening but still barren natural world as her larder. She would walk the verges of the woods and the edges of the paths, her eyes scanning the ground for the first signs of green life. The pottage would then be filled with strange and often bitter ingredients. The young, stinging leaves of the nettle, which lost their sting upon cooking, the bitter leaves of the dandelion, wild garlic, and even the tender buds from certain trees. It was a food of pure subsistence, its taste sharp, green, and often unpleasant. But it was a sign that the earth was waking up, that the abundance of summer would eventually return, that the great, slow, and terrifying cycle of hunger was almost over. The pottage was not just a meal. It was the living calendar of a peasant's life, a story of feast and famine told in a single, ever-present bowl.
The act of eating in a peasant cottage was as simple and as brutally functional as the food itself. The modern concept of a dinner table set with individual plates, a variety of cutlery, and delicate glasses was a fantasy as alien and as distant as the moon. The reality was a communal, tactile, and often hurried affair, governed by a different set of rules and a profound, grinding lack of material possessions. The centerpiece of every meal, its warm, steaming heart, was the cauldron. The same great black iron pot that hung over the fire all day, slowly simmering, was also the primary serving dish. There was no delicate transfer of the pottage into a tureen or a serving bowl. Such objects did not exist in this muddied hovel. The pot was simply lifted from its hook by Elspeth, using two thick, padded rags to protect her hands from the hot iron. Its bottom was black with years of accumulated soot. She would place it in the center of the room, either directly on the hard-packed earth floor, or, if the family was prosperous enough to own one, on the rough-hewn wooden table that served as the cottage's only piece of significant furniture. The family would gather around it, not in comfortable chairs, but on low, three-legged stools, or simply sitting on the floor on bundles of straw. The hierarchy of the family was reflected in the hierarchy of the meal. The father, Arnau, as the head of the household, was always served first. Elspeth would take a large wooden ladle, its bowl worn and stained from 1,000 meals, and scoop a generous portion of the thick, steaming pottage into his bowl. Then came the sons, in order of age, and finally the daughters. Elspeth herself would be the last to eat. There were no individual plates. For a liquid meal like pottage, each person had their own bowl. These were not delicate, glazed ceramics. They were simple, functional bowls, often carved from a single piece of wood, a craft known as treenware. They were thick, heavy, and often stained and scarred from years of use, each crack and imperfection a map of 1,000 simple meals. You could feel the texture of the wood grain under your fingers, a constant tactile connection to the forest. The primary eating utensil was the spoon. Also carved from wood, or sometimes from the horn of a cow or a sheep, the medieval spoon was often rounder and deeper than its modern counterpart, perfectly designed for scooping up the thick, lumpy pottage. The fork was an object of immense rarity and suspicion, an exotic and effeminate import from Italy, associated with the decadent and sinful habits of foreigners. It would not be found in a humble cottage for centuries to come. To eat, you had your bowl, your spoon, and your hands. But the most important and most versatile piece of tableware was not a dish at all. It was the bread. The thick, dark, and dense peasant bread served a dual purpose. A thick slice of it, known as a trencher, was often used as a makeshift edible plate. If there was a rare piece of salted meat or a hard-boiled egg to be had, it would be placed directly onto the trencher. The hard, dense bread would soak up the juices and the fat, becoming a savory, flavorful treat in its own right. At the end of the meal, you could eat your plate. It was a perfect and waste-free system. The bread was also a utensil. You would tear off a piece of your daily ration and use it to scoop up the thick pottage, to push the food onto your spoon, and most importantly, to wipe your bowl clean at the end of the meal, ensuring that not a single precious drop of sustenance was wasted. The etiquette of the meal was simple and unwritten. You ate directly from your own bowl. You did not speak much. A meal was not a time for leisurely conversation. It was a time for refueling the body for the next round of back-breaking labor. The only sounds were the soft scraping of wooden spoons against wooden bowls, the sound of chewing, and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. You drank not from individual cups, but often from a shared vessel, a single large wooden tankard or a leather jug of ale or watered-down cider that was passed from person to person around the circle. This sharing was not just a matter of necessity, a result of the scarcity of possessions. It was a symbol of the family unit, of a shared struggle and a shared existence. Each person would take a sip and pass it on, a simple, unconscious ritual of communion. At the end of the meal, the cleaning was as simple as the meal. The wooden bowls and spoons were not washed with soap and hot water. Soap was a precious commodity, used for laundry, not for dishes. The bowls were simply wiped clean with the last piece of bread, or licked clean by the children or the family dog. Sometimes they might be scoured with a handful of clean sand and then rinsed in a bucket of cold water before being stacked away by the hearth, ready for the next identical meal. This was the physical reality of eating for the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages. It was a world without individual place settings, a world without forks, a world where the line between the plate and the food was often blurred. It was a communal, functional, and deeply earthy experience, a direct and unfiltered connection to the food that kept you alive.
While the peasant in his cottage was bound to the eternal monotonous cycle of the pottage pot, the city dweller, even the poor one, had access to a far greater and far stranger variety of food. The medieval city was a bustling, chaotic hub of commerce, and that included the commerce of food. This was the world of fast food, medieval style, a world driven by convenience, necessity, and a profound indifference to the modern notion of hygiene. Let us return to the muddy, crowded streets of a city like London or Paris. Imagine you are a laborer, an apprentice, or a traveler. You do not have a kitchen of your own or the time to cook. Your small, rented room in a crowded tenement has no hearth, no oven. But you are hungry, a deep, gnawing hunger that demands to be satisfied. Your only option is the street vendor, the cook shop, the purveyor of hot, ready-to-eat meals. The air in the streets is thick with the smells of cooking, a complex and often overwhelming tapestry of aromas that serves as the city's menu. You can smell the sweet, comforting scent of baking bread from the baker's oven, a smell of home and civilization. You can smell the rich, savory aroma of roasting meat from a cook shop, the fat dripping and hissing onto the hot coals, a smell designed to make your mouth water and your stomach ache with desire. You can smell the sharp, tangy scent of mustard, the most common condiment of the age, being ground in a great stone mortar. You can smell the sweet perfume of honey-sweetened wafers and the sharp, pungent aroma of aging cheese. It is a world of constant and often conflicting culinary temptation. The street itself is the restaurant. There are no quiet cafes, no clean tables. Vendors operate from simple wooden stalls or from portable braziers and carts. They are a vital part of the city's economy, feeding the great, hungry mass of the urban poor who do not have the means to cook for themselves. The most common and most popular form of medieval street food was the pie. The pie man, with his portable oven and his loud, booming voice, was a fixture of every city street. He sold pies of every description, their golden, flaky crusts a promise of a hot and filling meal. There were sweet pies filled with apples or pears or berries in the summer, but the most popular by far were the meat pies. A hot, savory pie, its crust holding in a steaming, mysterious filling, was a perfect, self-contained meal. It was hot, it was filling, it was portable, and most importantly, it was cheap. But what was inside? That was the great and often dangerous question. The reputation of the pie men was, to put it mildly, terrible. In a world with no refrigeration and no food safety regulations, the meat that went into a cheap pie was often of the most questionable quality. It was the leftovers, the scraps that the butcher could not sell to his wealthier customers. It was meat that was on the verge of turning, its flavor disguised by a heavy and often deceptive dose of pepper and other strong spices. And sometimes, according to the grim rumors and the satirical poems of the day, it was not the meat of a cow or a pig at all. The dark jokes about pies filled with the meat of stray dogs, cats, or even worse, were a constant feature of medieval urban life. The story of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber who turned his victims into meat pies, is a 19th century invention, but the fear it represents, the fear of the unknown, of the hidden, of the unspeakable, was a very real part of the medieval experience of buying a hot meal from a stranger on a dark street. To buy a meat pie from a street vendor was always a gamble. But the pies were not the only option. The city offered a surprising variety of other ready-to-eat foods. You could buy hot waffles and wafers from a vendor with a small, portable iron press, the sweet smell of the batter cooking over the charcoal fire, a welcome comfort on a cold day. You could buy pancakes or fritters, fried in hot fat until they were crisp and golden. For those with a little more money, there were the cook shops, the medieval equivalent of a rotisserie. Here you could see whole chickens, ducks, and geese turning slowly on a spit over a great open fire, their skin crisp and golden, their fat dripping and hissing into the flames below. You could buy a whole bird, or just a small, affordable piece of one, carved off with a long, sharp knife. There were vendors who sold nothing but cheese, their stalls a pungent and overwhelming display of hard, aged cheeses and soft, fresh ones. There were vendors who sold roasted chestnuts in the winter, their small braziers a welcome source of warmth and a delicious, nutty aroma. The medieval city was a place of constant and often surprising culinary activity. It was a world of strange flavors, of questionable ingredients, and of a vibrant and often dangerous fast food culture, a world away from the simple, monotonous, and predictable fare of the countryside.
The medieval street food vendor was not merely a cook, he was a master of logistics, an alchemist of the gutter, and a small-scale entrepreneur in a fiercely competitive and entirely unregulated market. His entire business had to be portable, efficient, and capable of operating in the cramped, chaotic, and filthy environment of the city street. Let us look closer at the Pie Man, the most iconic of these figures. His kitchen was a marvel of medieval engineering, a self-contained universe of heat and commerce on two wobbly wooden wheels. It was often a two-tiered cart that he would push through the labyrinthine streets, his loud, distinctive, and often lewd cry acting as his only form of advertisement. "Hot pies! Hot pies! Good for the belly and cheap on the purse," he might shout, his voice a hoarse, familiar sound in the daily symphony of the city. The bottom tier of his cart would be a small, insulated firebox, a heavy clay pot filled with slow-burning charcoal that provided a steady, even heat throughout the long day. The top tier was the oven itself, a small, clay-lined chamber where the pies were kept warm, their savory aroma wafting through the streets, a siren song to the hungry laborer, the weary traveler, the penniless student. The pies themselves were made in a separate, often squalid back-alley bakery in the pre-dawn hours, under conditions that would horrify a modern health inspector. The crust was a simple affair, a tough, durable pastry made from the cheapest flour and lard or suet. It was not designed to be a delicate, flaky delight. It was designed to be an edible container, a sturdy vessel to hold the mysterious, often liquid, filling. And the fillings were a mystery, a closely guarded secret that was the subject of much dark humor and grim speculation. The pie man would buy his ingredients from the butcher at the end of the day. He would not buy the fine cuts of pork or beef. He would buy what was left over, what the butcher could not sell to his wealthier customers. The organs, liver, lungs, heart, the gristle, the scraps, the fatty bits.
He would boil this motley collection of animal parts for hours in a great black cauldron until it was tender enough to be minced into a uniform grayish paste. To this paste, he would add a heavy and often deceptive dose of seasoning. Pepper, the most common and powerful spice, would be used to mask any hint of the meat being off. Nutmeg, cloves, and ginger might be added to give it a more exotic and therefore more desirable flavor. This gray, mysterious, and heavily spiced paste was then encased in the tough pastry and baked. To eat a medieval meat pie was an act of faith. You would hand over your coin, and the pie man would retrieve a hot, greasy parcel from his cart with a pair of iron tongs. There were no napkins, no disposable containers. You would eat it with your hands, trying to navigate the hot, often liquid filling without it spilling onto your tunic. It was a quick, cheap, and deeply satisfying meal, but it was always accompanied by a small, nagging doubt about the true nature of its ingredients. Beyond the pies, the cook shops offered a more substantial, though still basic, meal. These were not restaurants with tables and chairs. They were simply open-fronted shops, their interiors dominated by a great roaring fire pit. Here you could buy a portion of roast, usually pork or goose, or bake, a kind of simple casserole of meat and breadcrumbs. You would not eat it on the premises. You would be given your portion on a thick slice of bread, the sops, which would soak up the precious fat and gravy. Then you would take your meal and eat it in a nearby alleyway or on the steps of a church, a solitary and often hurried affair. The cook shops also played a vital role in the life of the city dweller. If you were a relatively prosperous artisan, a master craftsman with your own small workshop, you might be able to afford a fine cut of meat or a whole chicken, but you probably did not have an oven large enough or the fuel to spare to cook it in. So you would take your own uncooked meat to the cook shop. For a small fee, the cook, a man with a perpetually sweaty face and a stained apron, would roast it for you in his great oven, alongside the chickens of a dozen other families. It was a communal, outsourced form of cooking, a necessary service in a city of small, kitchenless homes. And then there were the drinks, the liquid fuel of the medieval city. Water, as we know, was a dangerous gamble, often drawn from polluted rivers or contaminated wells. The safe, everyday drink for everyone, from children to the elderly, was small ale or small beer. It was a weak, low-alcohol beer brewed from barley. The fermentation process killed most of the harmful bacteria, making it a much safer option than water. Taverns were on every street corner, their doors always open, their interiors dark, smoky, and filled with the sound of loud, drunken conversation. They sold ale by the tankard, a thick, cloudy, and often sour beverage that was the bloodline of the city. For a moment of warmth and comfort in the winter, you could buy hot, spiced wine from a street vendor. The sweet, fragrant steam a welcome relief from the cold, damp air. This was the complex and often precarious ecosystem of medieval street food. It was a world of convenience and of danger, of savory smells and of questionable ingredients. A world that fed the great, hungry, and perpetually moving heart of the medieval city. The taste of medieval street food was a taste of pure, unadulterated sensation. It was not a world of subtle, balanced flavors, of delicate herbs and nuanced sauces. It was a world of extremes, a world designed to jolt the senses of a population accustomed to the bland, unchanging monotony of the daily pottage pot. It was a cuisine of necessity, of preservation, and of clever, sometimes dangerous deception. The dominant flavor profile was one of heavy, almost overwhelming seasoning. Spices, particularly black pepper, were the ultimate status symbol. They were impossibly expensive, a dark, magical dust imported from the exotic, far-off, and almost mythical lands of the East. The spice trade was a long, perilous, and incredibly lucrative business, and the price of a small bag of peppercorns in a Paris market could be equivalent to a craftsman's weekly wage. For the nobility, the lavish use of spices was a direct statement of wealth and sophistication. A dish that was heavily spiced was a dish that screamed of money. But in the hands of the humble street vendor, spice was not just a symbol of luxury. It was a powerful and necessary tool of deception. A heavy dose of pepper, of cloves, of ginger could work wonders on a piece of meat that was slightly past its prime, that was beginning to acquire the faint, sweetish tang of decay. The fiery heat of the pepper and the pungent aroma of the cloves would not just complement the flavor of the meat, they would dominate it, masking any off flavors, any hint that the ingredient was not as fresh as it should be. This heavy seasoning also acted as a mild preservative, the natural oils in the spices helping to slow the process of rot in a world without refrigeration. To the medieval palate, a strongly spiced taste was often a sign of safety as much as a sign of luxury.
Texture was also key. In a world where the daily food of the poor was often a soft, mushy, uniform gruel, the contrast of a crisp, flaky pie crust with a satisfying crunch of a hot, honey-sweetened waffle was a source of immense pleasure. The cookshops, with their roasted meats, offered another textural delight. The crisp, crackling skin of a roasted pig or goose, a coveted delicacy that was often fought over. But to eat in the city was to be constantly, acutely aware of the risks. There was no concept of public health as we know it. The same river water that was used for drinking by the poorest of the poor was also used for washing, for dyeing cloth, and for disposing of the waste from the tanneries and the slaughterhouses. A street vendor might rinse his vegetables in this water. He might add it to his stews. The risk of contracting a sickness of the bowels, a dysentery that could easily be fatal, was a constant and accepted part of city life. The risk of adulteration was also ever present. Unscrupulous vendors were known to mix sand or dirt into their flour to increase its weight. They would color cheap sour wine with berries to make it look like a more expensive vintage. The meat in the pies was a constant source of suspicion and dark humor. To eat your meal, you would find a quiet corner, a doorway, or the steps of a church. You would sit with your back to the wall for safety, and you would eat with your hands, the grease from the pie running down your chin. You would be watched by the hungry eyes of the street urchins, by the hopeful gaze of a stray dog, by the indifferent glances of the other city dwellers who were all engaged in their own small daily battles for survival. This was the complex and often precarious experience of eating in the medieval city. It was a world of intense flavors, of strange and surprising ingredients, of a constant nagging doubt about the quality and the origin of your meal. It was a world where a hot, greasy meat pie bought for a single penny from a man with dirty hands on a muddy street could feel like the most delicious and most dangerous meal in the world.
Beyond the daily food of the peasant and the townsman, the simple fuel for a life of labor, there lay another culinary universe, that of the strange, the bizarre, and the forbidden. This was a world governed not by the seasons or by the availability of ingredients, but by a power even more absolute, the unwavering, all-encompassing authority of the Catholic Church. The influence of religion on the medieval diet cannot be overstated. The Church, through its complex calendar of feast days and fast days, dictated what a person could and could not eat with the force of divine law. For nearly half the year, during the entire 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter, every single Friday, and on the vigils of numerous religious festivals, the consumption of meat from land animals, and often their products like eggs, cheese, or milk, was strictly forbidden. To knowingly eat meat on a fast day was not a simple indulgence. It was a mortal sin, a stain on the soul that required confession and penance, a transgression that could, in the minds of the truly devout, jeopardize one's eternal salvation. For the wealthy, this prohibition was not a hardship. It was merely a culinary challenge, an opportunity for their skilled cooks to display their artistry within a different set of rules. The lean feasts of a great lord or a rich bishop were often even more extravagant than their regular meals. The tables would groan under the weight of an incredible variety of fish. There would be great salmon poached in spiced wine. There would be pike, its flesh prized for its firmness, often molded and decorated to look like a mythical beast. There would be carp and tench and bream from the Lord's own fish ponds, a living larder of acceptable food. There would be eels jellied or baked into magnificent pies. From the coasts would come barrels of salted herring, the beef of the sea, as well as more luxurious fare like oysters, mussels, and crabs. The cooks would create elaborate illusions, molding fish paste into the shape of a ham or a roasted chicken, a clever, almost playful deception designed to delight the eye and the palate without technically breaking God's law. But for the common peasant or the poor artisan, the fast days were a period of true gastronomic misery. Their diet, already monotonous, was stripped of its few small comforts. The pottage, which might occasionally be enriched with a piece of salted bacon, became a thin, watery gruel of barley and whatever root vegetables were left. The bread seemed harder, the hunger more pronounced. The fast was a constant, gnawing reminder of their poverty and their piety. It was in this context of widespread religiously mandated deprivation that one of the most bizarre and ingenious loopholes in culinary history was born. The prohibition was on the flesh of land animals, but the definition of what lived on land and what lived in the water was, shall we say, flexible. The theologians and scholars of the time, basing their arguments on a mixture of folklore, incomplete observations of the natural world, and a desperate desire for a richer diet, began to classify certain animals in a way that seems completely absurd to us today. The beaver, for example. This semi-aquatic rodent with its rich, fatty meat was a tempting prize. Theologians, noting its flat, scaly tail and its life spent in and out of rivers, argued with a straight face that the tail, at least, was essentially a fish. Therefore, while roasting and eating the main body of the beaver on a Friday would be a sin, consuming its tail was perfectly acceptable. Imagine the scene. A peasant, after weeks of cabbage pottage, trapping a beaver in a river. He is not just a hunter, he's a theologian in his own right, carefully butchering the animal according to the strange hybrid nature assigned to it by the church, his conscience clear as he prepares the fishy part for his family's meager Lenten meal. This logic, once established, was applied with an enthusiastic and creative lack of scientific rigor. The puffin, the seabird that spends most of its life on the ocean and nests on high cliffs, was also by some classified as a fish. But the most extraordinary example, a testament to the medieval mind's capacity for both faith and self-deception, is that of the barnacle goose. No one in medieval Europe had ever seen a barnacle goose's nest for the simple reason that they bred in the distant, unknown lands of the high Arctic. All the people of the British Isles and coastal Europe knew was that these goose appeared, as if by magic, every autumn. Lacking a better explanation, they turned to a theory born of a strange observation. They found strange stalked crustaceans, goose barnacles, clinging to pieces of driftwood that washed up on the shores. When these barnacles opened, they revealed a small feathery creature inside. From this, the seemingly logical but entirely wrong conclusion was drawn. Barnacle geese did not hatch from eggs like other birds. They grew on trees in the sea. They were a form of marine fruit. This was not a piece of peasant folklore. It was a widely accepted scientific fact, discussed and debated by learned men in monasteries and universities, and its culinary implications were profound. If a barnacle goose was essentially a fruit of the sea, then it was not a creature of the flesh. Therefore, eating a roasted barnacle goose during Lent was perfectly permissible. It was a loophole of magnificent proportions, a way to enjoy a rich, fatty bird during the leanest, most pious days of the year, all with the full, if slightly strained, blessing of theological reasoning. It was a cuisine of justification, a theology of the dinner plate, where the human desire for a satisfying meal found a way to bend the very laws of nature and of God.
The great social divide of the Middle Ages was never more apparent than in the butchering of an animal. When a pig, a sheep, or a cow was slaughtered, the finest cuts, the hams, the loins, the roasts, were destined for the high table of the lord or the wealthy merchant, but the peasant, or the urban poor, did not waste a single precious part of the carcass. The parts of the animal that we today often discard or relegate to pet food were, for them, a treasure trove of nutrition and the foundation of a rustic, inventive, and surprisingly flavorful cuisine. The organs, the intestines, the head, the feet, the blood, the parts collectively known as offal or the umbles, were the kings of the common table. The blood of the animal, carefully collected in a large bucket at the moment of slaughter, was far too valuable to be thrown away. It was immediately mixed with a filler, oats, barley, or stale bread crumbs, along with suet, the hard, crumbly fat from around the kidneys, chopped onions, and a pungent mix of herbs and spices like pepper and allspice. This dark, rich, and iron-heavy mixture was then carefully funneled into a clean section of the animal's own intestine, which was then tied off at both ends. This sausage, known as black pudding, was then gently boiled until firm. It could be eaten immediately, its taste rich and earthy, or it could be smoked and hung from the rafters of the cottage, where it would keep for months, a dark, reassuring presence promising a savory meal in the lean times to come. To fry a thick slice of this pudding with an onion was a feast, a meal that was both deeply nourishing and profoundly satisfying. The head of a pig or a sheep was also considered a great delicacy. It was not a sight for the squeamish. It would be singed over an open flame to remove the bristles, then scrubbed clean. It was then placed in the great cauldron and boiled for hours, often with onions, carrots, and herbs, until the meat, the skin, and the fat literally fell away from the bones. The entire contents of the pot were then strained, the bones and teeth discarded. The tender meat from the cheeks, the tongue, and even the ears and the snout was finely chopped and generously seasoned. This meat was then pressed into an earthenware pot or a mold. The rich gelatinous broth from the boiling was poured over it. As it cooled, the natural collagen from the skin and cartilage would set into a firm jelly, binding the entire creation together. This was head cheese, or brawn, a dish that allowed for the complete consumption of the animal's head and which could be sliced and eaten cold with a piece of hard bread and a dollop of sharp mustard. The tripe, the stomach lining of a cow or a sheep, was another staple. This required a long and laborious cleaning process, a task often reserved for the women of the household. The tripe had to be turned inside out, scraped clean, and washed countless times in the river or at a well until it was a pale, almost white color. Once clean, it was simmered for hours upon hours with onions and milk until it became meltingly tender. It was a dish with a strong, distinctive smell and a unique, chewy texture, but it was deeply nourishing, a true comfort food for a cold winter's night. Even the feet were not discarded. Pigs' trotters, boiled slowly for a long time, would release their gelatin, creating a rich, savory broth that could transform a simple pottage of vegetables into a much more substantial and flavorful meal.
They were a cheap and easy way to add the precious and often rare taste of meat to the daily diet. This was a nose-to-tail cuisine, a philosophy born not of a trendy modern culinary movement, but of a profound and deeply ingrained understanding of necessity. It was a cuisine that understood the value of every single part of the animal, a cuisine that knew how to transform the humblest, most unappealing of ingredients into a meal that could sustain a family through the hardest of times. It was the true and often forgotten taste of the common folk of the Middle Ages. In the strict hierarchy of medieval hunger, game meat occupied a separate, almost mythical realm. The flesh of wild animals, the noble stag, the swift roe deer, the fierce wild boar, and even the simple rabbit, was considered the finest, the purest, and it was, by law, the exclusive property of the lord. The forest was not a free space. It was the nobleman's personal larder, a symbol of his power that extended beyond the cultivated fields and into the deep, untamed woods. Forest laws of extreme severity, enforced with ruthless brutality, protected this privilege. A peasant caught setting a snare for a hare or tracking a deer did not face a simple fine. He faced a terrible punishment, designed to be a public and terrifying example, a flogging in the village square, the amputation of a hand so he could never again draw a bow, or even hanging from the nearest oak tree. And yet, despite the terror of the law, poaching was a common and desperate practice. It was not a sport, nor an act of casual defiance. It was an act of survival, a desperate calculation where the risk of a violent death was weighed against the certainty of a slow one by starvation. For a peasant like Arnau, who tasted meat only a few times a year at the great religious feasts, the taste of a roasted rabbit was an almost unimaginable luxury, a taste of freedom that was worth risking his life for. Imagine a moonless night, a darkness so profound that the sky and the earth merge into a single black void. Arnau, or a man like him, slips out of his hovel in silence, his heart a frantic drum in his chest. He moves into the forest, a dark and threatening territory that is forbidden to him by day and doubly so by night. Every crackle of a twig underfoot, every howl of an owl in the distant trees is a source of pure, primal terror. He fears not just the spirits of the night, the creatures of folklore that are whispered about by the fireside. He fears a far more dangerous encounter, the Lord's game warden, a hard, often cruel man whose sole duty is to protect his master's game from the hungry bellies of the peasants. Arnau knows the forest as he knows his own hand. He knows its hidden paths, the habits of its creatures, the places where the deer come to drink at the stream. He moves with the stealth of a predator, his senses sharpened by years of practice, every nerve ending alive to the sounds and smells of the night. He checks the snares he laid days earlier, his hands trembling in the darkness, not from cold, but from a nervous tension. One of them is sprung. He approaches with infinite caution, his knife in his hand. A rabbit is caught in the wire loop, its small, silent struggle now over. It is a small victory, but a victory that could cost him his life. He quickly and silently dispatches the animal, puts it in a rough burlap sack, and meticulously erases any sign of his presence, straightening a broken branch, smoothing over a footprint in the damp earth. The journey home is even more nerve-wracking. Every shadow is a potential threat, every sound the approaching footsteps of the game warden. He slips back into his cottage and bars the door, his back pressed against the wood, his breathing shallow and ragged. The rabbit will be butchered silently by the dying light of the hearth's embers. Its skin and bones will be buried deep in the garden, where they will never be found. The next day the meat will not be roasted, for the smell would be too distinctive and might attract the attention of a neighbor or the village reeve. It will be cooked slowly in the pottage cauldron, its wild, gamey flavor mingling with that of the root vegetables, a secret ingredient in the eternal stew. That meal, the taste of fresh, tender, wild meat, will be the best-kept secret of the family. It's a taste of profound luxury, of a world beyond their own, a taste made all the more delicious and all the more terrifying by the fact that it is forbidden. This, too, was the cuisine of the Middle Ages, a world of strict, unyielding rules, of crushing deprivation, and the constant and often fatal desire to taste just once the food of the masters.
To understand the taste of the Middle Ages, one must first understand the overwhelming, all-encompassing importance of a single, humble ingredient: salt. In our modern world, salt is a cheap, ubiquitous commodity, present on every table. In the Middle Ages, salt was white gold. It was a geological and strategic resource as vital as oil is today. Its production was difficult, its transportation was expensive, and it was heavily taxed by lords and kings. Salt was a source of immense wealth, and its control was a source of power. For the peasant or the common townsman, salt was precious. It was used with extreme parsimony to season dishes, but its primary and most vital role was not to enhance flavor. It was to defeat the greatest enemy of humanity before the invention of refrigeration: time. Salt was the master of preservation. Imagine the scene of the family pig being slaughtered in the autumn. Once the animal was butchered, a race against time began. Fresh meat in a world without artificial cold would last only a few days before it began to rot. To survive the winter, that meat had to be preserved, and the primary method was salting. The largest cuts, like the hams, were meticulously rubbed with handfuls of coarse salt, a process that had to be repeated day after day for weeks. The salt slowly penetrated the flesh, drawing out the water and creating a hostile environment for the bacteria that caused decay. Other pieces of meat were cut into strips and submerged in great wooden barrels filled with brine, a solution of water and salt so concentrated that an egg could float in it. Fish underwent the same treatment. Herring and cod, caught in vast numbers in the northern seas, were immediately gutted, beheaded, and packed in barrels with enormous quantities of salt, either directly on the ships or in the bustling ports of Alexandria and Constantinople. This was the quintessential Lenten fish, the protein that would feed Europe during the long, meatless months of fasting. This method of preservation was incredibly effective, but it had a dramatic and defining consequence for the palate. Medieval food was not lightly salted, it was saturated with salt. A salted ham or a piece of dried cod was inedible in its natural state. Before it could be cooked, it had to undergo a long process of desalting. It had to be soaked in several changes of fresh water for hours or even days to draw out the excess salt and make it barely palatable. Therefore, the dominant taste of meat or fish for the majority of the population for most of the year was the taste of salt. It was a powerful, aggressive, and often overpowering flavor, one that masked the delicate natural taste of the flesh itself. It was a taste of necessity, a taste of survival. If salt was the pillar of preservation, then spices were the opulent and often deceptive mask of luxury. In the medieval imagination, the Spice Islands of the Far East were a semi-mythical paradise, a place of fragrant forests and unimaginable wealth. The spices that originated there, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, were not mere flavorings. They were a dark, magical dust, a tangible piece of that exotic world. The journey of these spices to a European market was a long, perilous, and incredibly lucrative one. They traveled thousands of miles, passing through the hands of countless middlemen. They were carried by camel caravans across the vast deserts of Arabia, sailed across the Indian Ocean by Arab dhows, and then loaded onto the galleys of Venetian and Genoese merchants in the bustling ports of Alexandria and Constantinople.
Each stage of this long journey added to their cost. By the time a small sack of peppercorns arrived in a Paris or London market, it was worth, quite literally, its weight in gold. A man could buy a house for the price of a pound of nutmeg. Spices were a currency, a status symbol, and a source of immense power. Consequently, the use of spices was the most obvious social marker in the kitchen. At a great lord's banquet, a dish that was heavily spiced was not just a demonstration of the cook's skill, it was a brazen declaration of the lord's power and wealth. It was a way of saying to his guests, "Look at my riches. I am so powerful that I can afford to consume treasures from the other side of the world, to burn a fortune on a single meal." The cooks in the great houses used spices with an abundance that would seem shocking and even nauseating to our modern palates. The sauces were thick, complex, and loaded with a riot of conflicting flavors. A sauce for a meat dish might contain ginger, cinnamon, cloves, saffron for its magnificent golden color, all bound together with toasted breadcrumbs and soured with verjuice, the tart juice of unripe grapes. The goal was not to enhance the natural flavor of the meat, but to completely transform it, to mask it under an opulent and deeply fashionable layer of exoticism. The sheer power of the spice was the point. But this massive use of spices had another darker and more pragmatic function. In a world without refrigeration, even in a castle kitchen, the freshness of meat was always a concern. A side of venison that had hung for a day too long, a fish that had made a long journey from the coast, they would all begin to acquire the first faint, sweetish tang of decay. Spices, with their powerful, pungent flavors, were the perfect mask for this incipient rot. The fiery heat of the pepper, the numbing quality of the cloves, the strong aroma of the ginger, these could overwhelm the taste of meat that was beginning to spoil, making the inedible edible once more. The spices were not just a seasoning, they were a form of culinary alchemy, a way of transforming the tainted into the palatable. Furthermore, many spices, particularly cloves and pepper, had natural antiseptic and antibacterial properties. While medieval people did not understand the science behind it, they knew through centuries of experience that a heavily spiced dish was less likely to make them sick. The spicy taste, therefore, was not just a sign of wealth, it was in a strange way a sign of safety, a promise that the food, no matter its true age, had been rendered harmless by the power of these expensive, imported powders. For the common person, of course, this world of exotic spices was a distant dream. Their seasoning came from the garden and the fields. Mustard, grown easily throughout Europe, was the pepper of the poor. Its sharp, fiery heat provided a welcome kick to the bland daily pottage. Garlic and onions were used in abundance. Their strong, savory flavors, a reliable and cheap way to add interest to a meal. And the herb garden provided a subtle palette of other flavors: parsley, sage, thyme, and rosemary. This was the great culinary divide of the Middle Ages. The food of the poor was simple, direct, its flavors derived from the earth. The food of the rich was a complex and often deceptive performance, its flavors a loud declaration of wealth and a powerful mask for the ever-present reality of decay.
So, what was the taste of the Middle Ages? For the overwhelming majority of the population, for a peasant like Arnaud, it was a taste of simplicity, of the earth, and of endless repetition. It was the earthy, slightly sweet taste of root vegetables pulled from the cold, damp soil, their flavour a direct reflection of the land they came from. It was the blandness of boiled grains, a thick, gritty paste that filled the stomach without ever truly satisfying the palate. It was the sour, dense tang of black bread, its crust as hard as stone, its crumb heavy and moist, a food that was less a pleasure and more a fuel for aching muscles. And above all, it was the overpowering, aggressive taste of salt in the meat of the rare feast day, a flavour so potent that it masked all others, a taste of preservation, of winter, of a constant gnawing anxiety. A peasant's flavour palette was limited, dictated not by choice, but by the soil itself and the unforgiving cycle of the seasons. For the wealthy townsman or the great lord, the taste was radically, almost violently different. It was an assault on the senses, a culinary performance designed to impress and to dominate. It was the taste of meat, often too salty, but its salinity counteracted not by simplicity but by an aggressive complexity. The sauces were thick, sweet and sour concoctions, combining acidic virtues with the sweetness of honey or dried fruits, creating a constant tension on the tongue. It was the taste of pepper, of cinnamon, of cloves, of spices so powerful that they completely masked the natural flavour of the main ingredient. To eat a meat dish in a castle was not to taste the meat, it was to taste the wealth of the host, to taste his ability to purchase exotic powders from the other side of the world. It was a cuisine of ostentation, of disguise, where a skilled cook could transform a fish into an illusory ham for Lent, where the golden colour of saffron was more important than the flavour itself. It was a world where food was never neutral. It was a statement, an indelible marker of your place in God's ordained social order. It was a reflection of your wealth or your poverty, a tool of survival or an instrument of power. Every single meal was a story. The story of a peasant's labour etched into the coarse texture of his bread. The story of a merchant's long and dangerous journeys concentrated in a single precious peppercorn. The story of faith and of fear embodied in the strange fishes of Lent. To take a bite of the past would be to taste a world that was at once simpler and infinitely more complex, a world where food was the very beating and often aching heart of life itself. It would be to taste the constant fear of hunger, the suspicion of an unfamiliar dish, the simple, profound joy of a hot meal after a day of cold, hard labour. It would be to discover that the line between the delicious and the disgusting, between the fresh and the rotten, between sustenance and poison, was a thin, often blurry, and sometimes non-existent line. And every single bite, from the blandest pottage to the most heavily spiced pie, would be a testament to the incredible and often desperate ingenuity of the human will to survive.